Israel, as if he's gathered the entire company of Israel. We don't know how many he was actually talking to, but clearly this is a public gathering where Samuel is saying his farewell. He says to all Israel, I have listened to everything you said to me and have set a king over you. He says, you've requested this, and of course, God has granted it, and so I did it. And this is not a situation where God has been uncooperative. He's given you what you want, so you need to understand that in light of whatever might happen next. And so he says, now you have a king as your leader, and as for me, I am old and gray. My sons are here with you. I have been your leader from my youth until this day. What does he say? He says a couple of things there. First of all, he says, I've had this job my entire life. I'm now old and gray. I understand you're worried about who the next leader would be, but abandoning God, such as you have at this particular moment, mistake. It's a big mistake, in fact. And so what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to remind you about the problems that this entails. And he starts off by doing something that even Eli, if you remember from past chapters, even the high priest was unwilling to do with his own sons. He left them, even though he lamented their wickedness, he left them in their positions of authority. And so that is not what Samuel does. Here, Samuel, in fact, he removes his sons from their positions of authority and leadership. And he says, they are here with you, meaning that they are even among you. They're one of you now. And so I wish for the success of this plan, even though I am fearful for its failure. And he says, I'm old and gray, but my sons are here with you. I want this to happen, to be successful as much as possible. Verse 3, here I stand, testify against me in the presence of the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? And from whose hand have I accepted a bribe to make me turn my eyes? If I have done any of these, I will make it right. Basically, he says, what problem did you have with me? What was so awful about my leadership? Now, it may sound like Samuel is taking this offense personally, but he's actually speaking on behalf of him and God, because God is the one who's been removed. Remember, God said to Samuel, don't take this personally. It is me they have rejected. Samuel's reminding them, was it really so bad? Let me just examine in totality what it is that you've rejected. If you had a problem with me, if you had a problem with something I did I take your donkey? Did I oppress any of you? Did I look the other way and take a bribe? Did I do any of these things? And the people of Israel say, no. And Samuel says to them, you have not cheated or oppressed us. That's actually what the people of Israel say. You have not taken anything from anyone's hand. You haven't stolen from us. You haven't mistreated us. This is not what we're saying, Samuel. Okay, he says. Verse 5, Samuel said to them, the Lord is witness against you and also has anointed us witness this day that you have not found anything in my hand. He is witness, they said. So God himself verify that I have not cheated these people. Do you agree with that? The people say yes. So this is appointed time of teaching conversation, right? This is a teachable moment. And so Samuel is going to choose this time to do that. Verse 6, Samuel said to the people, it is the Lord who anointed Moses and Aaron and brought your forefathers up out of Egypt. Now then, stand here because I'm going to confront you with evidence before the Lord as all the righteous acts performed by the Lord for you and your fathers. He says, brace for it. I'm about to bring you some uncomfortable facts. One is, and he's hinting at what he's going to go walk through here, Moses and Aaron were not chosen as a vote of the people. Much as we, as Americans, love our democracy, democracy is the worst possible political system except for all the others, is what people used to joke about. It is not the best system, but at least democracy takes into account the sinful nature of human beings. Checks, balances, making sure that no one abuses the system or abuses one another. And in a perfect world, that would work perfectly. It doesn't, but it probably does the job better than most systems in the world. Well, democracy is not something given by God. Even though democracy correctly shows that people are not to be trusted because of their sinful nature, it also kind of paints the ending judgment about right and wrong in terms of what people say. Yes, based upon the influence of God, but based upon what people have determined to be right. It is in no way a theocracy, God leading his people. And non-Christians get real nervous when you start talking about a theocracy. But a true theocracy, God leading us, would be the optimum as far as a government system. And the problem is that people get in the way of that. Certainly now, with the people of Israel, they have gotten a human king in the way of that process. So we know from the story of Saul that Saul's going to be problematic. He's not going to be terribly faithful to God. And so what they're going to find is that he is a mixed bag. As much as they want him to solve all of their problems and make their lives easier, God was actually doing a much better job of the very things they suggest that an earthly king will help with. So we go from there. They say you haven't oppressed us, not at all. And Samuel says, well, guess what? The people that brought you to this place in the first place, Moses and Aaron, those appointed leaders, were appointed by God, and they were not appointed by you. It's probably a good thing, because you might have chosen somebody else. In verse 8, after Jacob entered Egypt, they cried to the Lord for help, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your forefathers out of Egypt and settled them in this place. So you owe to them, and God's choice, the current situation of having your own land and not being slaves in the land of Egypt. You have them to thank for that. As much as you're belly aching about your lack of comfort and the things that you wish were going on, you are not a slave in Egypt, and that is because of the choices that God had for leaders. And those leaders were flawed, but they were God's choices, God ordained. So, in verse 9, they said, but they forgot the Lord their God. And so he sold them in the hands of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hatzor, and into the hands of the Philistines and the king of Moab, and others who had fought against them. They cried out to the Lord and said, we have sinned. We have forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. Now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you. Well, that's the process. That's the continuous slide that happens over and over and over and over and over again. The problem happens because we come to the Lord and we offer apology and we ask for forgiveness, and then we go right back to doing the same things over and over and over again. It is foolishness, foolish behavior, to continue to do things over and over and over again and expect different results. That's where the people of Israel are at. It's where a lot of us are in our walks with God. We want to continue in the same behavior, trust the same things, and yet we want God to pull our fat out of the fire. Well, the reason why these guys have the success, the situation in life, the relationship in the first place is because of God. And they've forgotten that, choosing very quickly to go completely to a human king. And the standards that they set for that king, I mean, he's tall, he's very good looking, he's intimidating looking with a sword in his hand. Okay, looks good on TV. What does that do for him as a leader? Well, they've got the one that they want, and Samuel reminds them that Saul is another indication that the people of Israel have left their first love. Yes, he behaves properly in the previous chapter. Yes, he trusts God in the middle of his righteous anger. But very easily he could have been something different. Very easily he could have gone his own way in that situation. And we know later on in Saul's relationship with God, that's exactly what he does. So he continues. They forgot the Lord their God. So you had the situation in Hatzor. You have the situation with the Philistines that is ongoing. You have the king of Moab that charged in and was barely destroyed. You have all of these things that have happened, and then they cry out to the Lord and say, forgive us. Now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you, right? Then verse 11, the Lord sent Jerubbaal, technically, and that is Gideon. Again, Gideon known by his pagan name, because at the end he started kind of feeling his oats a little bit, and his name literally means Baal will contend with you, meaning that Baal will be your judge. Well, Baal can't be his judge because Baal doesn't exist. So what that name literally means is that your actions, your attitude will catch up with you, and you've left your first love, which is Jehovah God. Now you worship a God who does not exist. Barak, who was the general partner with Deborah, remember that prophetess and female judge, And they led that battle against Hatzor, its mighty chariots and its mighty army, completely wiped them out. Jephthah and Samuel, these were judges that were brought up by God, and certainly not perfect, but brought to bear on the problems that Israel caused by their own behavior. He delivered you from the hands of your enemies on every side so that you lived securely. You were safe. Even with your lack of faithfulness, God was faithful to protect you as people in the land, his own people. Verse 12, but when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, this was last chapter, was moving against you, you said to me, no, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord, your God, was your king. What's the problem? Well, they have reacted in fear. You think we make bad decisions when we're angry. Look at the decisions we make when we're fearful, when we give in to our terror. That's what the people of Israel did here. We want an intimidating king who will lead our armies onto the field of battle. So arrogant. And giving into this feeling of we're in over our heads. If we only had a mighty warrior, we would be fine. You have the God of the universe. You rejected him. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him, and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, then good. Now, what's he saying here? He said, now, you've chosen a king, you've set a king over you, and it's all good. If you follow the Lord and the king follows the Lord, then hey, we're golden. Everything's good. The problem with that is now you've introduced a third party to the covenant that we had together. God says, you will be my people and I will be your king. You obey my commands and I will protect you and guide you and nourish you and keep you close and all of those things. I will live up to my responsibility if you live up to yours. Now, we've already established that the people's faithfulness of the people of Israel was, well, problematic at best. But God was always faithful. And as Samuel is pointing out, judge after judge, helper after helper, military leader as needed were brought up to safeguard the people of Israel. The very thing that you wanted, a king who serves your needs, a king who protects you, a king that goes before you against your enemies, you had with God. And you've traded that security for an unknown in a human king who has his own sinful nature. Now it's not enough just for you to be faithful and God to be faithful back as he always is. Now it's required that you be faithful and your king be faithful. We're going to find out that with King Saul, that is terribly problematic. He has some good moments like we saw last chapter. He has more bad ones than that. Instead, Samuel says, there's no need to panic. As long as you fear the Lord and serve him only, it's all good. But your king needs to do that too. And you're the one who introduced that king to this nation. So that's your responsibility. But if you do not obey the Lord and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was against your forefathers. Remember, this was the circle of existence with your relationship with God. It was they sinned. God brought judgment to correct their sin, to bring them back to what they needed to be. The people would realize their sin. They'd call out to God for relief from the punishment, from their sufferings. He would send out a deliverer, usually a very flawed deliverer, because with the condition of the people of Israel, they would be freed of their bondage. They would say, thank you, Lord God, and then they return to the start of that circle and continue again and again and again. That's the whole theme of the book of Judges. All did what was right in their own eyes, and it seems like they were only faithful to God when they needed a leg up, when they needed to be saved from themselves. Well, that certainly is what he's threatening here. Samuel says, we'll repeat what happened with your forefathers, the very problem they were experiencing. And we'll continue with that if you cannot obey and your king cannot obey. But he says, I've done all I can. I have to withdraw. Your king needs to be up front now. I've done all I can. I'm not abandoning you. But what I am doing is saying I need to be less of the leader so that King Saul can be the betterment, can be the better for that. Supported and encouraged, but yet King Saul needs to be out front leading you. Now then, stand still and see the great thing that the Lord is about to put before your eyes. Is not harvest now? I will call upon the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. The problem is, when they're asking for a king, is that they discovered something very, very disturbing. And as they asked for a king, they replaced the Almighty Creator with a flawed human being. He says, let me demonstrate that to you. And he calls upon the Lord. And that same day, the Lord sent thunder and rain, and all the people stood in awe of the Lord. End of Samuel. Verse 19. The people said to Samuel, pray to the Lord your God for your servants, so that we will not die, for we have added to our other sins the evil of asking for a king. Notice what they said. Praise or call upon, pray to your God, Samuel. You see, the hearts of the people have already left God behind. And they say, pray to your God. Keep him off our backs. Don't let him destroy us. We really are sorry about the way we behaved. But our personal relationship with God is done. It's over. We've hitched our wagon to this Saul character, and we're all in with him. But make sure you apologize to God for us. Verse 20, do not be afraid, Samuel said. You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. You know what? That's what you're asked to do, fellow Christians. To serve the Lord with all your heart. What does God want from you? Perfect behavior? Please, he knows that it's not possible. Please don't use that as an excuse to continue sinning. Well, I'm a big sinner anyway, and God will never forgive me. God will forgive you. Your heart's condition needs to be in search of God, chasing down God, pursuing him with the best of your heart, wanting to be close to him, wanting to know more about him. That's how you grow closer to God. What was God's great thing to say about King David? I keep bringing this up over and over again because people don't quite understand the relationship God had with David. King David committed horrendous crimes that if he existed in today's world, he'd spend year upon year upon year in our prisons. Horrible crimes to people that were loyal to him. And what did God say? It's a man after my own heart. Because when David is confronted with his sin, he does not simply say, boy, I'm really sorry I got caught doing that. He weeps. He weeps because he is terribly sad at how he has let down his Father God. He's let down the Lord. He's let down the Creator. Because he loves God. His heart beats after him. And his sin that he's done is horrendous. But even more than that, the sin that he has done, it's hurt God. So, being a man after God's own heart, it should be the goal. A man or a woman after the heart of God. It ought to be the goal of everyone who claims to serve God, who claims to love him. And then finally some advice, some warnings beyond just their behavior. Don't risk rejecting God again, Samuel says. He says this in verse 21. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you because they are useless. Don't simply change your processes because God is jealous, because God is, in your minds, one of a number of different gods, or one of a number of different coping mechanisms for dealing with the problems of your life. On the contrary, he's the only coping mechanism. He is the only solution to your problem of sin. He is the only answer to the problems of your life. Doesn't mean God makes your problems magically disappear, but nobody else or no other thing does that either. Especially when you've replaced God with something, not just someone. Replacing God with someone is useless because no one matches the power of God. Replacing God with something is useless because no thing possesses the power of God. In fact, most of what we attach ourselves to as we reject God, what good is it? It's not good because it doesn't have any power. Substances, food, possessions, rank, power, authority, fame, useless. How many famous people do you know with horrendous problems? You can watch them on some of these awful entertainment shows. Just how screwed up their lives are. Why? Because they got what they've been wanting their entire lives, fame, and they discover it's absolutely an empty pursuit. Now what do I do? I've gotten all the money in the world that I could possibly want, but it's empty. It doesn't suffice. Now what do I do? This is what happens when we replace God with a thing or a someone. neither of which has the power to make any kind of a difference for you and me. Do not turn away after useless idols. For the sake of his great name, verse 22, the Lord will not reject his people. That's good news, isn't it? The Lord will not reject his people. Not his Israelites, not his fellow Hebrews, not the people of Jesus Christ, Christians. He will not reject his people because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. Do you know that? The Lord is pleased to make you his own. He is excited. The Bible tells us that there's a party with the angels every time one person, one single person, chooses to follow Jesus Christ with their life. That's something we're celebrating. God delighted the day that he brought you into the kingdom. He loves you. And as for me, Samuel says, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right. He says, I'm going to keep praying on your behalf. I'm going to keep teaching you what is right in the sight of the Lord. But I'm going to take away my leadership. I'm still going to be an influence. I'm still going to be someone you can come to for help, a teacher, a guide, a mentor. But yet, I'm going to withdraw so that this leader, who has all of the help he could possibly need to be a faithful king before Jehovah God, we'll see what happens. But Samuel, even though he is optimistic, he doubts Saul will be anything more than a typical human being. That's what we find out he is. Verse 24, but be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. Do you do that? Do you consider what greatness God has done for you? Do you chase him down with your heart? Do you do that? Friends, that is how we get closer in our relationship with God. And that is how we see the advantage of following God with our lives. When we pursue him with our heart. Doesn't mean that we should be perfect in our obedience. God knows that none of us can do that. In fact, if he thought you and I could perfectly obey the law, Jesus would not have come. Jesus certainly would not have died and rose from the dead, because there would be no need to conquer sin and death. He would just tell us, keep working hard. Work harder because you're failing, you're falling short. He'd come down with a whip, start cracking the whip, get us to be better. But he knows for us just being better on our own doesn't get us there, doesn't get us far enough, not even close. Be sure that you are chasing down God with your whole heart. That's what made David special. Yet if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will be swept away. In other translations, it was called you will perish. There's much more forceful language, but at the very least, you will be swept away. What happened in 70 AD, if any of you history buffs out there? In 70 AD, General Titus of Rome came down and scattered the people of Israel, burned the temple to the ground, scattered the people of Israel. Israel as a nation no longer existed. And it would stay that way for almost 1900 years until Israel would be reformed in the general area that it stood before.